I sat across from my father at Romano's steakhouse, watching his weathered hands shake as he reached for his water glass. 18 years had passed since Frank Fletcher threw me out of his house, declaring that I wasn't worthy of carrying the family name. He'd chosen my sister Sarah instead, handing her everything on a silver platter, while I walked away with nothing but bruised pride and burning determination. Now here he was, this once proud man reduced to begging a stranger for help to save Fletcher Construction from complete collapse. The irony was absolutely perfect. In my leather briefcase beside my chair lay the merger documents that would reveal tomorrow morning exactly who had just acquired his entire operation through my shell company. The memory of that summer day 18 years ago still burned like acid in my chest. I was 22, fresh out of State University with my business degree, excited about joining the family company that my grandfather had built from nothing back in 1953. Grandpa Joe had started Fletcher Construction with a handshake, a pickup truck, and an unshakable belief that honest work would always find its reward. I'd spent every summer since I was 12 working alongside the crews, learning everything from pouring concrete foundations to reading architectural blueprints. By the time I graduated college, I could frame a house-run electrical wiring and calculate load-bearing requirements faster than most guys with 20 years of experience. I thought I was ready to take my place in the family legacy. Frank had other plans entirely. The announcement came during our annual 4th of July barbecue. 3 generations of Fletchers gathered in the backyard of our colonial home on Maple Street, along with our key foreman longtime clients and half the neighborhood. The smell of grilled burgers mixed with the sweet scent of Mom's apple pie cooling on the picnic table. Red, white, and blue bunting hung from the oak trees that Grandpa Joe had planted when he first bought the house. Frank stood up on the deck, tapping his beer bottle with a fork to get everyone's attention. His voice carried that authoritative tone he used on job sites when he needed workers to listen up. "I want to make an announcement about the future of Fletcher Construction." He began, his chest puffed out with pride. "As you all know, this company has been in our family for 3 generations. It's time to plan for the 4th. My heart pounded with anticipation. This was it. This was the moment I'd been working toward my entire life. After careful consideration, I've decided that Sarah will be taking over operations as vice president effective immediately. She's got the Fletcher instincts, the natural leadership ability, and most importantly, the backbone this business requires. The world went silent, except for the buzzing of cicadas in the evening heat. Sarah was 19 years old, halfway through her sophomore year studying art history at a private liberal arts college. She'd never swung a hammer, never read a building code, never even visited a construction site unless Dad forced her to come along for family photos. But she had something I apparently lacked. She was confident, charismatic, and completely comfortable being the center of attention. Where I was methodical and careful asking questions and double-checking specifications, Sarah made quick decisions and never looked back. Frank saw this as strength. I was beginning to realize he saw my thoroughness as weakness. "Roger." Frank continued, his eyes finding mine in the crowd. "You're a good kid, but you're too soft for this business. You overthink everything. Construction requires quick decisions and the ability to command respect from rough men. You've got book smarts, but that's not what builds buildings." The humiliation felt like a physical blow. 37 people were staring at me, watching my dreams crumble in real time. Uncle Tommy shifted uncomfortably on his lawn chair. Mrs. Peterson from next door suddenly found her potato salad fascinating. Even Grandpa Joe's old foreman, Eddie Martinez, couldn't meet my eyes. Sarah stepped forward, her blonde hair perfectly styled, despite the humid summer evening. She wore a white sundress that probably cost more than most of our workers made in a week. "I'm honored to accept this responsibility," she said, her voice clear and confident. "I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm excited about bringing fresh ideas to Fletcher Construction. We're going to take this company to the next level." The crowd applauded politely. I noticed she didn't look at me once during her little speech. Frank put his arm around Sarah's shoulders, beaming with paternal pride. "This girl's got vision. She's already talking about expanding into commercial development, maybe even getting into real estate investment. That's the kind of forward thinking this company needs." I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I intended. "Dad, what about all the plans we discussed? The efficiency improvements, the new project management software, the employee training programs." Frank's expression hardened. "Roger, those are exactly the kinds of complications that slow down real progress. We've been doing things the same way for decades because they work. We don't need computers telling us how to pour concrete. But the industry is changing." I pressed on, desperation creeping into my voice. "If we don't adapt, we'll get left behind. The new environmental regulations alone require completely different approaches to material sourcing and waste management." "See?" Frank addressed the crowd, as if I wasn't standing right there. "This is what I mean. Roger's always looking for problems instead of solutions. In construction, you've got to trust your gut and move fast. There's no time for endless analysis." That's when he delivered the killing blow. "Son, I love you, but you're just not worthy of the Fletcher name in this business. You don't have what it takes to lead men or build something lasting. Maybe you should consider a nice office job somewhere, something that matches your temperament better." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. I looked around at the faces of people who had watched me grow up, who had taught me everything I knew about construction, who had praised my work ethic and attention to detail every summer. Now they were all studying their shoes or suddenly needing to refresh their drinks. Sarah finally broke the silence. "Roger, I hope you'll stay on and help me learn the ropes. I could really use your support as I transition into this role." The condescending sweetness in her voice was the final straw. She was offering me the chance to train my own replacement to smile and nod, while she took credit for everything our grandfather had built. I set down my beer bottle and walked toward the house. Mom caught my arm as I passed the kitchen window. "Roger, honey, maybe you should think about this overnight. Your father's just trying to do what he thinks is best for the company." I kissed her cheek, breathing in the familiar scent of her lavender perfume one last time. "I love you, Mom. Take care of yourself." By sunrise the next morning, I'd packed everything I owned into my used Ford pickup truck. I left my house key on the kitchen counter along with a note saying I was heading west to find my own path. I didn't say goodbye to Frank or Sarah. I figured they were probably too busy planning their glorious future to notice I was gone. As I drove through our neighborhood for the last time, I passed the job sites, where I'd learned to work with my hands, where Grandpa Joe had taught me that every foundation had to be perfect because everything else depended on it. I made myself a promise that day. I would build something better than Fletcher Construction, something that would make them realize exactly what they'd thrown away. 2 weeks later, I discovered just how deep Frank's betrayal ran. I was working for a small contractor in Phoenix, trying to establish myself in a new market, when I called a potential client who had initially seemed interested in my services. The conversation went cold immediately. "Look, kid," the developer said, "I got a call from Frank Fletcher back in your hometown. He told me you had some problems with reliability and anger management, said you couldn't handle the pressure of real construction work, and that I should be careful about trusting you with anything important." I hung up the phone and sat in my studio apartment staring at the water stain on the ceiling. It wasn't enough for Frank to reject me and humiliate me in front of everyone I'd ever known. He was actively sabotaging my attempts to build a new life anywhere within a 500-mile radius of home. That night, I started making phone calls to every contact I had in the construction industry. The story was always the same. Frank Fletcher had reached out personally to warn them about his unstable son who couldn't be trusted with important projects. Instead of breaking my spirit, this betrayal forged something harder inside me. If Frank wanted to destroy my reputation, I'd build a new one so impressive that nobody would care what he had to say. I'd start from zero and climb higher than he'd ever dreamed possible. And someday, somehow, I'd make sure he understood exactly what he'd lost when he chose Sarah over the son who actually understood what it meant to be a Fletcher. 3 states away from home, in a town where nobody knew the Fletcher name. I started over with nothing but my work boots and a determination that burned hotter than the Arizona sun. Phoenix was booming in the early 2000s, with subdivisions sprawling across the desert faster than contractors could frame them. I rented a tiny studio apartment in a complex that catered to construction workers, the kind of place where the pool was always broken and the air conditioning barely worked. My neighbors were mostly men like me trying to build something from nothing, though none of them were running from family betrayal. The first 6 months were brutal. I took whatever work I could find, starting as a basic laborer on crews that needed an extra pair of hands. Digging trenches in 110-degree heat, hauling materials up 3 flights of stairs, cleaning job sites until my fingers bled from handling rough concrete blocks. But every evening, exhausted as I was, I studied. I bought every construction trade magazine, every book on project management, every manual on new building techniques I could afford. While other guys were drinking beer and watching television, I was learning about revolutionary approaches to energy efficiency, studying case studies of successful construction companies, and teaching myself computer-aided design software on a used laptop I'd bought from a pawn shop. My breakthrough came when I landed a job with Desert Sun Construction, a mid-sized company that specialized in commercial projects. The owner, Jake Morrison, was old-school tough but fair. He noticed that I could read blueprints better than guys with twice my experience and that I never made the same mistake twice. Roger Hytry, he said one day as we wrapped up work on a small office building, "I've been watching you. You've got something most of these guys don't have. You think 3 steps ahead." I'd been working on the electrical subcontractor's schedule, trying to figure out why they kept falling behind and throwing off our timeline. After studying their workflow for a week, I realized they were wasting hours every day because they didn't have a systematic approach to wire routing. If we rearrange the sequence and have them start from the top floor instead of the ground level, they can use gravity to help run the major cables, I explained to Jake. Plus, if we coordinate their schedule with the HVAC installation, both crews can share access equipment instead of each team renting separate scaffolding. Jake implemented my suggestions, and the project finished 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The electrical subcontractor was so impressed that they started requesting me specifically for their jobs. Word spread that this young guy from back east had ideas that could save time and money. That's when I started offering consulting services on the side. Nothing fancy, just practical solutions to common construction problems. I'd walk through a job site, identify inefficiencies, and propose streamlined approaches that reduced waste and improved timelines. My first consulting client was struggling with a restaurant renovation that was running months behind schedule and thousands of dollars over budget. The problem was coordination. The plumbing crew would finish their work, then the electrical team would need to access the same areas and accidentally damage the new pipes. Then the flooring contractor would show up before the painters were done and track primer across the freshly installed tile. I spent 3 days creating a detailed timeline that synchronized every trade based on the logical sequence of dependencies. Plumbers first, but only in specific zones. Electrical second, but with clear protection protocols for finished plumbing. Painters third, with temporary barriers to protect completed electrical work. Flooring last, but with careful scheduling to avoid conflicts. The project finished on time and $30,000 under the revised budget. The owner was so grateful that he recommended me to 5 other restaurant developers. Within 6 months, I had more consulting requests than I could handle while still working my regular job. That's when I met Jim Caldwell. I was reviewing blueprints for a hotel project at a coffee shop near downtown Phoenix, when an older gentleman at the next table leaned over. "Excuse me, son, but I couldn't help noticing those plans. Are you working on the Hampton project?" Jim was 72 years old, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that comes from decades of success. He'd built Caldwell Development into one of the largest construction companies in the Southwest before selling it to a national firm and retiring to consultant work. "I've been in this business for 50 years, he said after I explained my background, "and I've never seen someone your age read structural drawings with that level of comprehension. Where did you learn to see load distribution patterns like that?" We talked for 3 hours that first day. Jim had started with nothing, just like me, but he'd built an empire by understanding that construction was really about managing relationships, resources, and risk. He'd seen the industry transform from handshake deals to complex corporate structures, and he recognized that the next transformation was already beginning. The companies that will dominate the next 20 years are the ones that figure out how to combine old-school craftsmanship with new technology and business innovation, he told me. Most construction executives are either too set in their ways or too inexperienced to navigate that transition. But you might be young enough to adapt and experienced enough to understand what really matters. Jim became my informal mentor, teaching me about corporate finance, strategic acquisitions, and long-term business planning. He introduced me to his network of architects, developers, and investors. Most importantly, he helped me understand that my real competitive advantage wasn't just technical skill, but the ability to see inefficiencies and devise systematic solutions. "Roger," he said one evening as we reviewed financial statements for various construction companies, "you have a gift for operational analysis. Most people in this business focus on individual projects. You naturally think in terms of systems and processes. That's what transforms good contractors into industry leaders." Under Jim's guidance, I incorporated my consulting business and started taking on larger projects. I hired 3 other young engineers who shared my passion for innovation, and we developed proprietary software for construction project management that integrated scheduling, resource allocation, and cost tracking in ways that existing systems couldn't match. We called the company Apex Development Group, a name that reflected our commitment to reaching the highest standards in everything we did. I chose the name carefully, wanting something that suggested excellence without revealing my personal history. By my 4th year in Phoenix, Apex was managing projects worth millions of dollars. We specialized in complex commercial developments that other companies found too challenging or risky. Our reputation for finishing ahead of schedule and under budget attracted clients from across the Southwest. But I never forgot about Fletcher Construction. I subscribed to industry publications from my home state, tracked their projects through public records, and maintained contact with suppliers and subcontractors who worked with them. I was building detailed intelligence about their operations, their financial health, and their competitive position. What I discovered was both satisfying and concerning. Sarah had indeed brought fresh ideas to Fletcher Construction, but most of them involved cosmetic changes that looked impressive in marketing materials, without addressing fundamental operational issues. She'd redesigned their logo, updated their website, and started attending networking events where she charmed potential clients with her confidence and enthusiasm. But the actual construction work was suffering. Project timelines were increasingly unreliable. Cost overruns were becoming common, and their reputation among subcontractors was deteriorating. Frank was trying to compensate by bidding on larger projects, but this only magnified their operational problems. Through industry contacts, I learned that Fletcher Construction had been awarded a major government contract to build a new federal courthouse. The project was worth $12 million and would be their largest undertaking ever. Sarah was being credited in trade publications as the visionary who had positioned the company to compete for such prestigious work. But I recognized the project specifications immediately. They were nearly identical to a proposal I'd written during my senior year of college, a theoretical case study for efficiently managing large-scale government construction projects. I'd spent months researching federal building requirements, sustainability standards, and security protocols. I'd left a copy of that thesis in my childhood bedroom when I packed up and left home. Sarah hadn't developed innovative new capabilities. She'd simply repackaged my old ideas and presented them as her own vision for the company's future. The irony was perfect, but it also revealed something troubling. If Fletcher Construction was winning contracts based on strategies they didn't truly understand, they were heading for disaster. And when that disaster arrived, it would threaten not just Frank and Sarah, but also the dozens of workers who depended on the company for their livelihoods. I realized I had a choice to make. I could continue building my own success and let Fletcher Construction face the consequences of their decisions, or I could find a way to position myself to intervene when their inevitable crisis arrived. Jim helped me think through the strategic implications. "The question isn't whether you should help them," he said. "The question is how to structure your involvement so that you can save the valuable parts of what your grandfather built, while ensuring that the people responsible for the problems learn appropriate lessons." That's when I started planning for acquisition rather than simple revenge. If Fletcher Construction was going to fail, I wanted to be in position to preserve its assets, protect its workers, and continue the legacy that Grandpa Joe had created. But first, I had to become successful enough that acquiring them would be feasible, and that meant expanding Apex Development Group from a regional consulting firm into a multi-state construction and development company with enough resources to handle major acquisitions. The work began immediately. Within 18 months, I'd opened offices in 3 additional states, hired experienced construction managers from established companies, and begun the systematic process of building the kind of empire that could make Frank Fletcher's operation look small by comparison. Every night, as I reviewed financial projections and expansion plans, I thought about that summer barbecue when Frank declared I wasn't worthy of the Fletcher name. He was right about one thing: I wasn't going to be the kind of Fletcher he wanted. I was going to be something much more impressive. 5 years after leaving Phoenix and everything I'd built there, I stood in the corner office of my new headquarters in Dallas, watching the sunset paint the skyline gold and red. Apex Development Group had become one of the fastest-growing construction companies in the Southwest, but I knew we were ready for the next phase of expansion. The transition from regional player to national contender required a completely different approach to business development. Instead of competing for projects one at a time, I'd started acquiring smaller construction companies that gave us immediate market presence in new territories. The strategy was surgical and methodical. I'd identify family-owned construction businesses that were struggling with succession planning or cash flow problems, then approach them through intermediaries who could negotiate acquisitions without revealing my personal involvement. The owners usually assumed they were selling to a corporate investment firm rather than a young man with a personal vendetta against his own family. My first acquisition was Mountain View Construction in Colorado, a company that specialized in high-altitude building projects, but lacked the capital to bid on larger developments. The owner, Carl Brennan, was 68 years old and ready to retire, but his son had chosen a career in software engineering instead of following the family tradition. "I've been doing this for 43 years, Carl told me during our final negotiation meeting. "Started with my dad when I was 17, took over when he had his heart attack, and built this company project by project. But I can't compete with these big national firms anymore. The margins are too thin, and the paperwork requirements are beyond what a small operation can handle." I structured the deal to let Carl stay on as a consultant, while we integrated Mountain View's local expertise with Apex's resources and technology. Within 6 months, they were bidding on projects 3 times larger than anything they'd attempted independently. Carl's crews loved the improved equipment and better benefits, and his longtime clients appreciated the enhanced capabilities without losing the personal relationships they valued. The model worked so well that I replicated it across 8 states. Each acquisition brought local market knowledge, established client relationships, and experienced workers who understood regional conditions and preferences. But more importantly, each deal taught me how to preserve what was valuable about family construction businesses while eliminating the inefficiencies that limited their growth potential. Amanda Richardson entered my life during the acquisition of Lone Star Commercial Development in Austin. She was the architect on a mixed-use project we were bidding, and her innovative approach to sustainable design caught my attention immediately. Where most architects focused on either aesthetics or functionality, Amanda had figured out how to integrate environmental performance with cost-effectiveness in ways that actually improved both. Our first conversation was supposed to be a 30-minute project review. It lasted 4 hours. Most construction companies see sustainability as an expensive add-on, she said, spreading blueprints across the conference table in her firm's offices. But if you design the systems integration correctly from the beginning, green building techniques can reduce total project costs while creating long-term operational savings for the end users. She was right, and she could prove it with detailed financial analysis that showed how upfront investments in energy efficiency would generate measurable returns over the building's lifetime. More importantly, she understood that construction projects succeed or fail based on how well dozens of different specialists coordinate their work. Amanda challenged me intellectually in ways I'd never experienced. She'd graduated from Rice University with degrees in both architecture and environmental engineering, then earned her MBA from Wharton while working full-time for one of Houston's premier design firms. But unlike many highly educated professionals, she also understood the practical realities of construction work because she'd spent summers working for her uncle's contracting business. "You're different from other construction executives I've worked with," she told me over dinner after we'd successfully completed our first project together. "Most of them see buildings as products to be manufactured as cheaply as possible. You seem to understand that every building becomes part of a community's long-term infrastructure." Our relationship developed gradually built on professional respect that deepened into personal connection. Amanda appreciated my systematic approach to problem-solving, while I was fascinated by her ability to visualize complex spatial relationships and translate abstract design concepts into practical construction specifications. When I finally told her about my background and family history, she listened without judgment or surprise. "So you're building this empire partly to prove something to your father," she said matter-of-factly. "That's not unusual. Most successful entrepreneurs are driven by some combination of vision and personal motivation. The question is whether your success will ultimately be about revenge or about creating something meaningful." Amanda understood ambition because she had plenty of her own. She'd left her secure position with an established firm to start her own practice specializing in projects that combined architectural innovation with environmental responsibility. We became partners in both business and life, pushing each other to think bigger and aim higher. Together, we developed a new approach to construction projects that integrated design engineering and building from the earliest planning stages. Instead of the traditional model where architects create plans and construction companies figure out how to build them, we created collaborative teams that worked together to optimize every aspect of development. The approach was revolutionary, and it generated results that impressed even our most skeptical competitors. Projects finished faster because potential problems were identified and solved during design rather than during construction. Costs were lower because the building methods influenced design decisions rather than being an afterthought. And the final buildings performed better because every system was designed to work together efficiently. Word of our innovative methods spread throughout the construction industry. We started getting requests to speak at conferences, to consult on challenging projects, and to partner with other companies that wanted to adopt our integrated approach. But I never lost focus on my long-term objective. Every success brought me closer to having the resources and reputation necessary to deal with Fletcher Construction when their inevitable crisis arrived. Which was why I'd hired Marcus Webb. Marcus was a private investigator who specialized in corporate intelligence, the kind of discreet professional who could gather information about business operations without attracting attention or raising suspicions. His monthly reports kept me updated on Fletcher Construction's financial health project status and internal dynamics. The news was increasingly troubling. Sarah's management style was creating serious problems that Frank either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. She'd implemented expensive new marketing initiatives and office renovations while cutting costs on essential operational areas like equipment maintenance and worker training. More concerning, there were signs that Sarah was developing a gambling problem. Marcus had documented multiple trips to casinos, increasing credit card debt, and unexplained cash withdrawals from company accounts. The pattern suggested someone who was struggling with addiction and potentially using company resources to fund their habit. The federal courthouse project that had initially saved Fletcher Construction was becoming a disaster. Quality control issues were creating costly delays, subcontractors were complaining about late payments, and government inspectors were raising questions about material specifications that didn't match approved plans. Based on what I'm seeing, Marcus reported during one of our monthly meetings, Fletcher Construction is heading for a serious crisis within the next 12 to 18 months. The government contract is barely keeping them solvent, but if they lose that revenue stream or face penalties for non-compliance, they'll be looking at bankruptcy within 60 days. The information confirmed what I'd suspected. Sarah's confidence and charisma had masked fundamental inexperience with the operational complexities of major construction projects. She'd won the contract by promising things the company couldn't actually deliver, and now they were trapped in a cycle of corner-cutting and cost overruns that would eventually collapse under its own weight. Frank was apparently trying to manage the crisis by taking on additional debt and micromanaging every aspect of operations, but his interference was only making the coordination problems worse. The experienced foremen who had worked for Grandpa Joe were retiring or leaving for other companies, taking decades of institutional knowledge with them. But the most disturbing revelation came in Marcus's 8th monthly report. Sarah's gambling problem had escalated to the point where she was embezzling money from company accounts to pay her debts. She'd been falsifying invoices, skimming from employee pension funds, and using her access to company credit lines to fund casino trips. The amounts are getting larger and more frequent, Marcus explained. She's stolen approximately $270,000 over the past 18 months, and the pattern is accelerating. She's also borrowed money from some very dangerous people who don't typically extend payment deadlines for business reasons. I sat in my office that night staring out at the Dallas skyline thinking about the cruel irony of the situation. Frank had chosen Sarah because he believed she had the backbone and instincts necessary for the construction business. Instead, she was destroying everything Grandpa Joe had built while putting herself and potentially Frank in physical danger. Amanda found me there at midnight, still reviewing Marcus's reports and trying to decide how to respond. "You're going to help them, aren't you?" she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I should let them face the consequences of their choices," I replied. Frank made it clear that I wasn't family anymore. Sarah chose to accept everything that should have been partly mine. They created this situation through their own arrogance and poor judgment. "But you're not going to let them destroy what your grandfather built," Amanda said. "It wasn't a question." She was right, of course. Regardless of how Frank and Sarah had treated me, Fletcher Construction represented 3 generations of honest work and community contribution. The company employed 63 people who had nothing to do with our family drama. And somewhere in that failing organization were the values and traditions that Grandpa Joe had instilled in me during those long summer days when he taught me that every foundation had to be perfect. If I'm going to intervene, I said, it has to be on my terms. I won't just bail them out so they can make the same mistakes again. There has to be accountability and real change. Amanda smiled. "So what's your plan?" I pulled out a legal pad and started sketching the framework for what would become the most complex and personally satisfying business deal of my career. If Fletcher Construction was going to be saved, it would be because they accepted help from the son Frank had declared unworthy of the family name. And when that help arrived, it would come with conditions that would force everyone involved to confront the true cost of the choices they'd made. The first warning came on a Tuesday morning in March when Marcus called me before 7 a.m. with urgency in his voice that I'd never heard before. "Roger, we need to meet today. The situation with Fletcher Construction just got dramatically worse, and there are safety concerns now that go beyond business problems." We met at a coffee shop in downtown Dallas, far from my offices, and any place where we might be overheard. Marcus looked like he hadn't slept, and the thick folder he carried contained photographs and documents that painted a picture of a company in complete freefall. The government inspectors found serious structural problems with the courthouse project. He began spreading photos across the small table between us. "Sarah has been authorizing the use of substandard materials to reduce costs and cover the money she's stolen. We're not talking about cosmetic issues here. We're talking about support beams that don't meet load-bearing specifications and electrical systems that violate basic safety codes." The photographs showed construction work that made me physically sick. Concrete foundations with visible cracks, steel reinforcement bars that were clearly the wrong gauge for the structural requirements, and electrical panels that had been installed without proper grounding systems. This wasn't just poor workmanship. It was negligence that could result in building collapse or electrical fires. The Federal Contracting Office has suspended all payments pending a complete engineering review, Marcus continued. They're also talking about prosecuting for fraud if they determine that the substandard materials were used intentionally to inflate profit margins. But the legal problems were just the beginning. The photographs Marcus showed me next revealed the human cost of Sarah's gambling addiction and financial desperation. She owes $420,000 to a loan shark operation run by Vincent Torino, Marcus explained. These aren't casino debts anymore. She borrowed directly from organized crime figures who don't negotiate payment plans or accept excuses. The surveillance photos showed Sarah meeting with men in expensive suits outside casino hotels, her body language revealing desperation and fear. In one image, she was clearly crying while one of the men gestured angrily. In another, she was handing over what appeared to be construction company documents, possibly as collateral for additional loans. Torino's people have made it clear that if Sarah can't pay within 30 days, they'll collect from her family instead, Marcus said. They've already started surveillance on Frank's house and your mother's gravesite, sending the message that they know how to hurt him emotionally as well as physically. The mention of my mother's grave filled me with a rage I hadn't experienced since that humiliating day at the family barbecue. Whatever sins Frank and Sarah had committed threatening to desecrate Mom's memory crossed lines that even organized criminals should respect. "Where is Sarah now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She disappeared 4 days ago, cleaned out her personal bank accounts, grabbed her passport, and vanished. Frank thinks she's visiting college friends, but her credit cards show charges from casino hotels in Atlantic City. She's probably trying to gamble her way out of debt, which means she's just digging the hole deeper. Marcus pulled out financial documents that showed the full scope of the disaster Sarah had created. She'd forged Frank's signature on multiple loan applications, mortgaged the family home, without his knowledge, and even borrowed against the life insurance policy Mom had left behind. The total debt exceeded $1.2 million, far more than Fletcher Construction could possibly pay, even if they completed the courthouse project successfully. Frank doesn't know about most of this yet, Marcus explained. Sarah has been intercepting mail and handling all the financial communications. He thinks the company is struggling but still viable. He has no idea that he's personally liable for loans he never actually approved. The cruelest irony was that Frank was working harder than he had in years trying to solve operational problems that he thought were caused by the complexity of the government project. He was putting in 18-hour days personally overseeing every aspect of construction and pushing his aging body to limits that worried the workers who'd known him for decades. "The stress is killing him," Marcus said quietly. "His foreman, Eddie Martinez, called me because he's concerned about Frank's health. The man has lost 30 pounds in 2 months, he's not sleeping, and he's developed a tremor in his hands that gets worse when he's frustrated." I stared at the surveillance photo of Frank standing alone in the half-finished courthouse, looking older and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Despite everything he'd done to me, despite the years of anger and resentment I'd carried, seeing him like this stirred emotions I thought I'd buried forever. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Torino's people have been asking questions about you." My blood went cold. What kind of questions? They know Frank has a son who left town years ago and became successful in construction. They're trying to figure out if you might be worth approaching as an alternative source of payment for Sarah's debts. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Not only were these criminals threatening Frank, but they were potentially targeting Amanda and our business as leverage to collect money that Sarah had stolen. They don't know about Apex Development Group yet. Marcus continued, "But it's only a matter of time before they connect Roger Fletcher to Roger Williams, the name you've been using for business purposes. When that happens, they'll realize you have significant financial resources." I'd legally changed my last name to Williams 3 years earlier, partly to distance myself from the Fletcher family drama, and partly to avoid exactly this kind of situation. But the name change wouldn't protect me indefinitely if organized crime figures started investigating seriously. "What's your recommendation?" I asked, though I was already forming my own plan. "You need to decide quickly whether you're going to help Frank or cut all ties and disappear until this situation resolves itself," Marcus said. "If you're going to intervene, it has to be soon, because Torino's deadline is in 3 weeks. And if you're going to stay out of it, you need to make sure there's no way they can trace you back to Apex Development Group." That evening, I sat in our home office with Amanda reviewing everything Marcus had discovered and trying to decide on the best course of action. Amanda had been quiet throughout my explanation, but I could see her analytical mind working through the complexities. "This isn't really about business anymore," she said finally. "This is about whether you can live with yourself if you let your father get hurt by problems your sister created." She was right, but the situation was more complicated than simple family loyalty. "If I bail them out," I said, "I'm not just paying Sarah's gambling debts. I'm enabling her addiction and teaching her that there are no real consequences for stealing and lying. That doesn't help anyone long term." "But if you don't intervene," Amanda replied, "your father could be seriously injured by people who don't care about teaching lessons or personal growth, and 63 innocent workers will lose their jobs when Fletcher Construction collapses." We spent hours that night researching Vincent Torino and his organization, trying to understand exactly what we were potentially dealing with. The news wasn't encouraging. Torino had been arrested multiple times for extortion and assault, but he'd never been successfully prosecuted because witnesses had a tendency to recant their testimony or simply disappear. His loan shark operation was particularly vicious, targeting people with gambling addictions who had access to significant assets or earning potential. The typical pattern involved offering easy credit at reasonable initial terms, then escalating the pressure dramatically once the borrower was in too deep to escape. "Sarah fits their perfect victim profile," Amanda observed. "Gambling addiction, access to company funds, family members with potential resources, and enough social status that she'll go to extreme lengths to avoid public exposure of her problems." By dawn, I'd made my decision. I couldn't let Frank get hurt by criminals, regardless of our personal history. But I also couldn't simply pay Sarah's debts and pretend the underlying problems didn't exist. Instead, I was going to force a confrontation that would resolve all of these issues permanently. The first step was arranging a meeting with Frank, ostensibly to discuss a potential business transaction, but actually to assess the situation firsthand and determine how much he knew about Sarah's activities. The second step was developing a comprehensive plan to neutralize the criminal threat, while ensuring that Sarah faced appropriate consequences for her actions. And the third step was figuring out how to preserve the valuable parts of Fletcher Construction while holding everyone accountable for the choices that had created this disaster. It was going to be the most complex negotiation of my career, with stakes that went far beyond money or business success. But if I could pull it off, I might be able to save my father's life, while finally proving that the son he'd rejected was worthy of the Fletcher name after all. The irony was perfect. Frank had always said that construction required quick decisions and the ability to command respect from dangerous situations. Now we'd find out if the son he'd dismissed as too soft had developed exactly those qualities. Romano's steakhouse hadn't changed much in the 18 years since I'd last been home. The same dark wood paneling, the same red leather booths, the same smell of grilled meat and garlic bread that had made it Frank's favorite restaurant for business dinners when I was growing up. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table that offered clear sight lines to both entrances while keeping my back to the wall. Marcus had confirmed that Torino's men were still watching Frank, and I couldn't afford to be surprised by uninvited guests at this meeting. Frank walked through the front entrance at exactly 6 p.m., looking around nervously as the hostess led him towards my table. The 18 years had not been kind to him. His thick brown hair had gone completely gray, deep lines creased his face around his eyes and mouth, and his once powerful frame seemed diminished, almost fragile. But what struck me most was the defeat in his posture. The confident swagger that had defined Frank Fletcher for as long as I'd known him was gone, replaced by the careful movements of a man who'd been beaten down by circumstances beyond his control. He slid into the booth across from me, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the water glass the server had provided. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Williams," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I know this is unusual, reaching out through intermediaries like this, but I'm in a situation where I need to explore every possible option." The irony of him addressing me formally, not recognizing his own son, after nearly 2 decades, was both painful and perfect. I looked exactly like he had at my age, but the expensive suit-styled hair and confident bearing apparently made me unrecognizable as the young man he'd dismissed as too soft for the construction business. "I understand your company is facing some financial difficulties," I said, keeping my voice neutral and professional. "My associates mentioned that you're looking to sell assets quickly." Frank's face crumpled slightly at the direct acknowledgement of his desperation. "Mr. Williams, I've been in the construction business for 37 years. I took over Fletcher Construction from my father-in-law and spent decades building it into something the community could depend on. But I made some mistakes in leadership decisions, and now I'm facing consequences that could destroy everything my family worked to create." The admission was more honest than I'd expected. Frank had always been proud to the point of arrogance, never admitting weakness or uncertainty. Seeing him acknowledge failure so directly told me just how desperate his situation had become. "What kind of mistakes?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Frank closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself before responding. "I have 2 children." He began, his voice barely above a whisper. 18 years ago, I chose to put my daughter in charge of operations instead of my son. I thought she had better leadership instincts, more natural charisma. I thought my son was too analytical, too cautious for the construction business. He paused, staring at his hands. "I was wrong about everything. My son understood this business better than I gave him credit for. He had ideas that could have modernized our operations, improved our efficiency, made us more competitive. But I was too proud and too set in my ways to listen to him." The pain in Frank's voice was genuine, and despite years of resentment, I felt an unexpected stab of sympathy for this broken man across from me. "What happened to your son?" I asked. "I drove him away," Frank said simply. I humiliated him in front of our entire community, told him he wasn't worthy of the family name, and made it clear that he had no future in our company. He left town, and I haven't spoken to him since." Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn newspaper clipping. 3 months ago, I read about a young man named Roger Williams, who won the National Construction Association's Businessman of the Year award. The article mentioned that he'd started with nothing and built a multi-state construction empire specializing in innovative project management and sustainable building practices. My heart stopped. Frank continued, his voice growing stronger. The ideas they described in that article were almost identical to suggestions my son had made years earlier. And when I saw the photograph, even though the name was different, I recognized something familiar in his face. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and desperate uncertainty. "Mr. Williams, I think the successful businessman I'm meeting with tonight might be my son Roger, who I wronged so terribly 18 years ago." The moment stretched between us, 18 years of pain and anger and regret hanging in the air like smoke. I could have continued the deception, completed the business transaction, and left Frank wondering forever whether his suspicion was correct. Instead, I leaned forward and said quietly, "Hello, Dad." Frank's face went white, then red, then crumpled completely, as 18 years of suppressed emotion crashed over him like a tsunami. He began crying, not the careful tears of a man trying to maintain dignity, but the raw, ugly sobbing of someone whose world had just shifted on its axis. "Oh God, Roger," he whispered between sobs. "Oh God, what have I done?" I waited while he composed himself, fighting my own emotional response to seeing this proud man completely broken by the realization of his mistakes. "I'm sorry," he finally managed. "I'm so sorry for everything. For not listening to you, for choosing Sarah over you, for trying to sabotage your career when you left. I was wrong about everything, and I've regretted it every day since." But before I could respond, Frank's phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah's name, but when he answered, the voice on the other end was definitely male. "Mr. Fletcher, this is Vincent Torino. I think it's time we had a conversation about your daughter's debt situation." Frank's face went pale as he listened to the voice on the phone. "She owes me $420,000 plus interest that's been accumulating for 6 months. Since she's decided to disappear rather than honor her commitments, I'm going to need you to make arrangements for payment within 72 hours. I could hear Torino's voice clearly in the quiet restaurant. "I understand you have a construction company and some real estate assets. We can work out a payment plan, but I'll need a substantial down payment to demonstrate good faith. Let's say $100,000 by Friday, and we'll discuss terms for the remainder." Frank tried to speak, but Torino cut him off. "Mr. Fletcher, I want to be clear about something. This isn't a negotiation. Your daughter borrowed money from me, and she used you as collateral whether you knew it or not. If you don't cooperate, I'll be forced to pursue collection through other means." The threat in Torino's voice was unmistakable. Frank looked across the table at me, his eyes wide with terror. "I understand," Frank whispered into the phone. "I'll figure something out." "I hope so for your sake," Torino replied. "I'll be in touch." Frank hung up and sat in stunned silence for several moments. "Roger," he said finally, "you need to leave, right now. These are dangerous people, and I can't let you get involved in this mess." That's when I noticed the black sedan in the parking lot through the restaurant window. 2 men in suits sat in the front seats watching our table. "Dad," I said calmly, "I think it might be too late for that." The next morning, I sat in the conference room of my corporate security firm, watching Vincent Torino's photograph appear on the wall-mounted screen as my head of security, David Chen, briefed me on everything his team had learned overnight. Torino operates a sophisticated loan shark business that targets people with gambling addictions who have access to significant assets, David explained. He's been under federal investigation for 2 years, but witnesses keep disappearing or recanting their testimony. David clicked to the next slide showing financial records and surveillance photos. Sarah Fletcher fits his perfect victim profile. gambling addiction, access to company funds, and family members with substantial resources. He deliberately cultivated her addiction by providing initial loans at reasonable terms, then escalated the pressure once she was in too deep to escape. I studied the timeline David's team had assembled. Sarah's gambling problem had started innocently enough, with occasional casino trips and online poker games. But Torino's organization had identified her as a potential target and systematically encouraged her addiction by offering easy credit and VIP treatment at casinos they controlled. The $420,000 debt is legitimate, David continued, but Torino structured the loans specifically to ensure Sarah couldn't pay them back through normal means. His goal was always to gain leverage over Fletcher Construction and the family's assets. Amanda sat beside me, reviewing the legal documents that would formalize my plan to resolve this situation permanently. The federal investigators will be very interested in Sarah's testimony about how Torino's organization recruited and exploited her addiction, she observed. If we can guarantee her safety and cooperation, we can help them build a solid case. But first I needed to find Sarah and convince her to face the mess she'd created, instead of continuing to run from it. Marcus had tracked her to Atlantic City, where she was staying at a casino hotel and gambling away what remained of the money she'd stolen. My security team had her under discreet surveillance, making sure Torino's people couldn't reach her before I had a chance to intervene. I flew to New Jersey that evening, bringing Amanda and David with me to ensure we could handle whatever we found. The Borgata Casino Hotel at 2 a.m. was exactly what I expected desperate people feeding slot machines with money they couldn't afford to lose the air thick with cigarette smoke, and the kind of desperation that makes people believe the next hand will solve all their problems. Sarah was at a blackjack table in the high-limit section, surrounded by empty drink glasses and betting chips worth more than most people made in a month. She'd lost weight since I'd last seen her, and her once perfect appearance was disheveled in a way that suggested she'd been gambling for days without proper sleep or meals. I approached the table quietly, taking the empty seat beside her. "Hello, Sarah." She looked up, her eyes unfocused from alcohol and exhaustion. It took several seconds for recognition to register. "Roger," she whispered, as if seeing a ghost. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to help you get out of the hole you've dug," I said calmly. "But first you need to step away from the table." Sarah's hands shook as she reached for her chips, but I gently stopped her. "Leave them," I said. "You're done gambling." For a moment I thought she might argue or try to run. Instead, she began crying, the same kind of raw sobbing that had overwhelmed Frank the night before. "I can't stop," she whispered. "I know I'm destroying everything, but I can't stop. Every time I try to quit, I tell myself just one more hand, just one more chance to win back what I've lost." I helped her up from the table and guided her to a quiet corner of the hotel lobby where Amanda and David were waiting. "Sarah," I said gently, "Torino's people have threatened to hurt Dad if you don't pay your debts. They've been watching his house, following him to work, making it clear that they know how to hurt him physically and emotionally." Sarah's face went white. "I never meant for Dad to get involved. Torino said the loans were just between him and me." "That was never true," David interjected. "Torino specifically targets people whose families have assets he can pursue if the primary borrower defaults. You were always just the entry point to get leverage over Fletcher Construction." I explained the plan we'd developed to resolve the situation safely and permanently. "The federal investigators need your testimony to build a case against Torino's organization," I said. "If you cooperate fully and help them understand how they recruited and exploited your addiction, they can protect you from retaliation while pursuing charges that will shut down their operation." Sarah looked skeptical. "What about the money I stole from the company I forged Dad's signature on loans embezzled from employee pension funds and used company credit lines for personal expenses? Even if the FBI protects me from Torino, I'm still looking at federal fraud charges." Amanda leaned forward, her voice calm and professional. The prosecution will be much more interested in Torino's organization than in pursuing charges against someone who was clearly being exploited, she explained. If you provide complete cooperation and agree to enter a comprehensive addiction treatment program, we can negotiate a plea agreement that focuses on restitution rather than jail time. But Sarah still didn't understand the full scope of what I was offering. How can I possibly make restitution? She asked. I've stolen over $400,000 from Fletcher Construction, plus all the money I owe Torino. Even if I worked for the rest of my life, I could never pay back that much. That's when I revealed the final piece of my plan. Sarah, I said, I'm going to buy Fletcher Construction from Dad and restructure it as a subsidiary of my company. You're going to work there under proper supervision, helping to rebuild what you damaged. Every penny of your salary above basic living expenses will go toward restitution until the debt is fully paid. Sarah stared at me in disbelief. You'd actually help me after everything I did, after I took everything that should have been partly yours. I'm not doing this for you, I said honestly. I'm doing it for Dad, for the 63 people who work for Fletcher Construction, and for Grandpa Joe's legacy. But if you're willing to take responsibility for your actions and commit to real change, then yes, I'll help you rebuild your life. The conversation with the federal investigators the next morning was exactly as straightforward as Amanda had predicted. Agent Patricia Morrison had been tracking Torino's organization for 2 years, and Sarah's testimony provided exactly the kind of insider information they needed to pursue charges. Mr. Torino's operation specifically targets people with gambling addictions who have access to business or family assets, Agent Morrison explained. They use sophisticated psychological manipulation to escalate the addiction while ensuring the victim becomes financially dependent on continued loans. Sarah's detailed account of how Torino's associates had cultivated her gambling habit provided special access to high-limit games and gradually increased her debt load while making the loans seem manageable, gave the FBI everything they needed to prove a pattern of criminal exploitation. In exchange for your complete cooperation, Agent Morrison continued, including testimony in federal court and assistance with ongoing investigations, we're prepared to recommend a plea agreement that focuses on supervised restitution rather than incarceration. 3 days later, I sat with Frank in the same conference room where I'd learned about Torino's threats, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. I still can't believe it, Frank said, shaking his head as he reviewed the acquisition documents. My son, who I treated so terribly, is saving my company and protecting our family from criminals. Dad, I said, I need you to understand that this isn't charity. Fletcher Construction will become a subsidiary of Apex Development Group, but it will operate according to my standards and procedures. That means modern project management systems, proper financial controls, and a commitment to quality that puts long-term reputation ahead of short-term profits. Frank nodded eagerly. Roger, I'll do whatever you think is best. You've proven that you understand this business better than I ever did. But I wasn't finished explaining the terms. You're going to stay on as a regional manager, but you'll be working for me and following systems I develop. Sarah will also work for the company, but in a supervised position focused on community outreach and addiction recovery programs. Every decision about major projects, financial commitments, or strategic direction will require my approval. Frank was quiet for several minutes, processing the reality that his son was now his boss, and his daughter was essentially starting over as an entry-level employee. I deserve that, he said finally. We both deserve that. But Roger, I need you to know how proud I am of what you've built. Not just the business success, but the kind of man you've become. You could have let us face the consequences of our mistakes, but instead, you found a way to save what was valuable while holding us accountable for what went wrong. 6 months later, I stood in the construction trailer overlooking the renovated federal courthouse project, watching Frank and Sarah work together to coordinate the final inspections that would clear Fletcher Construction of all quality control violations. The investigation of Torino's organization had been even more successful than the FBI had hoped. Sarah's testimony, combined with evidence from other victims who came forward once Torino was arrested, resulted in federal convictions for racketeering, extortion, and fraud. Torino was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, and his entire operation was dismantled. Fletcher Construction had been completely restructured according to the operational standards I'd developed at Apex. The federal courthouse project finished on time and under budget with quality work that exceeded all government specifications. The company's reputation for excellence was not only restored, but enhanced beyond what it had ever been under Frank's original management. Sarah had embraced her role in the company's community outreach program with an intensity that surprised everyone. She'd completed residential addiction treatment and was now working with other families affected by gambling addiction, using her experience to help people recognize and address the warning signs before they reached crisis situations. "I lost everything because I thought I could gamble my way out of problems instead of facing them honestly," she said during a presentation to local business leaders about addiction awareness. "My brother saved our family by showing me that real solutions require hard work, accountability, and the courage to ask for help when you need it." Frank had adapted to his new role with remarkable grace. Instead of resenting my authority, he seemed genuinely grateful for the structure and oversight that had eliminated the stress and uncertainty that had been killing him. "Working for you is like getting a masterclass in modern construction management," he told me one evening as we reviewed project schedules together. "I'm learning things at 68 years old that I should have figured out decades ago." But the most meaningful change was in our personal relationship. The anger and resentment that had poisoned our family for 18 years was finally healing, replaced by mutual respect based on honest acknowledgement of past mistakes and shared commitment to building something better. Amanda and I had decided to relocate our primary residence back to my hometown, partly to oversee the Fletcher Construction integration, but mostly because we'd realized that running away from family problems hadn't actually solved them. "You know what's interesting about this whole situation?" Amanda observed, as we walked through the construction site, where I'd learned to work with my hands as a child. "You achieved everything you set out to prove to your father, but the real satisfaction came from choosing forgiveness over revenge." She was absolutely right. All the business success in the world hadn't provided the emotional closure I'd found in those moments when Frank broke down and apologized when Sarah committed to rebuilding her life, and when our family finally started dealing honestly with the pain we'd caused each other. The federal courthouse project wasn't just a construction success. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people took responsibility for their mistakes and worked together to build something meaningful. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site, where 3 generations of Fletcher craftsmanship were finally united with modern innovation and ethical business practices. I stood beside Frank and Amanda at the groundbreaking ceremony for our newest project, a housing development specifically designed for military veterans transitioning to civilian life. "Ladies and gentlemen," I addressed the gathered crowd of city officials, veterans advocates, and construction workers. "This project represents everything we believe about building communities, not just buildings. Each home will incorporate energy-efficient design, accessible features for veterans with disabilities, and shared community spaces that encourage the kind of mutual support that helps people heal and thrive." The applause was warm and genuine, but what moved me most was seeing Frank's face as I spoke. The pride in his eyes wasn't the superficial satisfaction of a father claiming credit for his son's success, but rather the deeper contentment of someone who had learned to find meaning in work that served others. Sarah stepped forward to explain her role in the project's community outreach component. "As someone who nearly destroyed my family through addiction and poor choices," she said, her voice steady and confident, "I understand how easy it is to lose your way when you're struggling with problems that feel too big to solve. This housing development isn't just about providing affordable homes. It's about creating a supportive community where veterans can build new foundations for their lives, just like I've been able to rebuild mine. The past year had transformed Sarah in ways that went far beyond her recovery from gambling addiction. Working with other families affected by financial crisis and addiction had given her a sense of purpose that her previous role as Fletcher Construction's heir apparent had never provided. She'd discovered that helping people solve real problems was more satisfying than any casino jackpot could ever be. After the ceremony, Frank and I walked through the construction site together, examining the foundation work that would support the first phase of veteran housing. "You know what your grandfather would have said about this project?" Frank asked, running his weathered hand along a perfectly straight concrete form. "What's that, Dad?" "He always told me that the most important thing about any foundation is that it has to support not just the building you're planning today, but whatever needs to be built on it in the future. You never know what challenges or opportunities are coming, so you build it strong enough to handle anything." Frank paused, looking out over the site where dozens of homes would soon provide stability for veterans and their families. "I think that's what you've done with our family, Roger. You didn't just solve the immediate crisis with Sarah's gambling and the loan sharks. You built something strong enough to handle whatever comes next." He was right, though it had taken me years to understand the deeper lesson embedded in Grandpa Joe's philosophy about foundations. The success of Apex Development Group had never really been about proving Frank wrong or showing him what he'd lost when he chose Sarah over me. The real achievement was learning to build systems and relationships strong enough to survive mistakes, conflicts, and unexpected challenges. Amanda joined us as we reviewed the architectural plans that integrated her sustainable design innovations with traditional construction techniques that honored the Fletcher family's commitment to quality craftsmanship. "I've been thinking about what we want to do next," she said, spreading blueprints across the makeshift table in our site office. "There are hundreds of communities across the country that need exactly this kind of integrated approach to affordable housing, sustainable design, and community development." The vision she outlined was ambitious, but achievable. Instead of simply expanding Apex Development Group into new markets, we could create a model for ethical construction practices that other companies could adopt and adapt to their local conditions. We could establish partnerships with regional construction firms sharing our project management systems and design innovations while maintaining local ownership and community connections, Amanda explained. "It's a way to scale positive impact without creating the kind of corporate bureaucracy that stifles innovation and personal accountability." The model made perfect sense, and it addressed something I'd been thinking about for months. The construction industry was full of family businesses struggling with the same kinds of succession planning, financial management, and operational modernization challenges that had nearly destroyed Fletcher Construction. Instead of simply acquiring these companies or letting them fail, we could create a network of independent but coordinated firms that shared best practices while maintaining their unique local character and family traditions. That evening, as we celebrated the successful groundbreaking with a barbecue that reminded me of happier times from my childhood, I realized that the most meaningful success wasn't measured in dollars or project completions. Sarah approached me as I stood watching the sunset paint the construction site in shades of gold and orange. "Roger," she said quietly, "I know I've thanked you before, but I don't think you really understand what you've given me. It's not just the second chance or the job or even helping me get clean from the gambling addiction." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You showed me that it's possible to face the worst consequences of your mistakes and still build something meaningful from what's left. I spent months thinking my life was over, that I'd destroyed everything beyond repair. But working on these community projects has taught me that every ending can also be a beginning if you're willing to do the hard work of rebuilding." Frank overheard her comments and joined our conversation. "Your brother taught me something similar," he said to Sarah, then turned to address me directly. "Roger, I spent 18 years regretting the decision I made at that barbecue when I chose Sarah over you. I thought the mistake was permanent, that I'd lost my chance to have a relationship with the son who actually understood what this family business was supposed to represent. Frank's voice grew stronger as he continued. But what you've shown me is that mistakes don't have to be permanent if you're willing to take responsibility for them and work to make things right. Not just apologizing, but actually changing the behaviors and attitudes that created the problems in the first place. As the evening wound down and the construction crew packed up their tools, I found myself thinking about the unexpected journey that had brought us to this moment. 18 years ago, Frank had declared that I wasn't worthy of the Fletcher name because he thought I lacked the backbone and instincts necessary for the construction business. He'd been partially right. The young man who left home with nothing but bruised pride and burning resentment wouldn't have been capable of handling the complex challenges that had tested our family over the past year. But the experiences of building Apex Development Group learning from mentors like Jim Caldwell and developing the strategic thinking necessary to navigate corporate acquisitions and criminal threats had forged exactly the kind of strength that the construction business actually required. Not the superficial toughness that Frank had valued in Sarah's confident decisiveness, but the deeper resilience that comes from facing failure, learning from mistakes, and building systems strong enough to withstand unexpected pressures. 3 months later, I stood in the same courthouse that had nearly destroyed Fletcher Construction this time for the ribbon-cutting ceremony that officially opened the building for public use. Federal Judge Patricia Williams, who would be presiding over cases in the new facility, made remarks that captured the symbolic significance of the project's successful completion. "This courthouse represents more than just a new building for our community," she said. "It represents the kind of craftsmanship and integrity that we hope to see in all aspects of public service." The construction team overcame significant challenges to deliver a facility that will serve our community for generations to come. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that the project, which had almost destroyed our family business, had become the foundation for everything we'd built since. As we drove home that evening, Amanda and I reflected on the lessons embedded in our unexpected journey back to my hometown. "You know what's interesting about this whole experience?" she said. "You achieved everything you originally set out to prove about your business abilities and leadership potential. But the real satisfaction came from learning that success means creating something larger than yourself, not just accumulating personal achievements." She was absolutely right. The young man who had left home 18 years earlier had been focused on proving Frank wrong and showing him what he'd lost. The man who had returned was more interested in building foundations strong enough to support whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. 6 months later, as I watched Frank and Sarah work together to coordinate our latest project, a community center that would provide addiction counseling and job training services, I realized that we had achieved something more valuable than business success or personal vindication. We had learned that every foundation, whether it's supporting a building or a family or a community, requires the same essential elements: honesty about past mistakes, commitment to doing better in the future, and the kind of patient, careful work that builds something strong enough to last. The Fletcher name now represented not just 3 generations of construction expertise, but also the possibility of redemption, forgiveness, and the kind of growth that comes from facing difficult truths about ourselves and choosing to build something better. And as I looked out over the community we were helping to create filled with homes for veterans, support services, for families in crisis, and opportunities for people to rebuild their lives after making serious mistakes, I knew that Grandpa Joe would be proud of what his legacy had become. Not just a successful construction company, but a foundation strong enough to support whatever needed to be built next. What does it mean to you when someone gets a second chance to prove their worth after being written off by the people who should have believed in them most? Have you ever had to choose between holding on to justified anger or taking the harder path of forgiveness and rebuilding? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about family redemption and the power of building something meaningful from the pieces of what was broken. Don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to build new foundations, no matter how badly the old ones were damaged. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember that every ending can also be a new beginning if you're willing to do the hard work of rebuilding with integrity and hope.